In the grim darkness of the 41st millennium, there is only war, and that means there's more than just ground-based conflict. 40K is a sci-fi after all, so look to the skies and understand that those pinpricks of light are not all stars, but mighty ships dueling each other across the void. Today, we are talking about the battle fleet of the Adeptus Astartes. The makeup of a Space Marine fleet is different from chapter to chapter, but typically they all share the same goal: to facilitate ground-based operations. This tends to lead to the widespread use of ships that have a lot of armor, but not a lot of direct ship-to-ship firepower. However, tangling with Astartes ships is still never an easy task. For most Codex-compliant chapters, the overall fleet is managed by the captain of the 4th Company, known as the Master of the Fleet. This means any captain of the 4th must be well versed in the operation of a staggering amount of vessels and is responsible for promoting Marines from across their chapter into the fleet structure. However, there aren't usually too many battle brothers on board these ships unless you count the warriors preparing to make landfall. Marines who actually crew the ships act much more like supervisors for the chapter serfs that are responsible for the mundane tasks like maintenance, fire suppression, and cleaning. Servitors take care of the rest, leaving the Astartes crew to manage their sections and repel boarders. Unlike the Imperial Navy, there aren't many ship types across an Astartes fleet. A handful of smaller classes make up the rapid strike vessels, which often end up either patrolling Marine-held sectors or escorting larger ships in the fleet, while the larger elements of a battle group end up being only one of two options: strike cruisers or battle barges. It is admittedly a surprising lack of options for an army so big on versatility, but each of these ships is a one-stop shop for Astartes warfighting, as you will soon see. For now, let's just start with the smallest vessels, the escorts. Light, maneuverable, and punching way above its weight, the Cobra class is a common sight in most Imperial flotillas, including in the strike fleets of the Adeptus Astartes. The Cobra class is typically outfitted as a torpedo boat, its heaviest armaments being the plasma warhead missiles that are typical of most Imperial ships. This gives the Cobra the ability to strike at long range, which is good because it is not a particularly tough ship. Its armor is decent for its tonnage, but it's still an escort and as such, really can't expect to last long in a brawl with heavier classes of void ships. If the worst should happen and a Cobra finds itself in a close-range fight, the small escort does have a single weapons battery arranged along both sides and a turret mounted on the fore. This battery is typically composed of macro cannons, the largest iteration of the humble autocannon we know and love, which does great against other escort-sized ships, but is almost completely useless against anything larger. The strength of the Cobra, almost more than any other escort ship, is in numbers. Plasma torpedoes are strong enough to take down the capital ships, and in squadrons of between 2 and 6 vessels, a Cobra formation can outright destroy some of the largest threats in a space battle long before they get close to the fighting. Experimentation with the Cobra hull type has led to at least one other variant called the Viper class, which trades up the macro cannon batteries for one additional torpedo tube system. Originally, it was thought that this would be a good way to deliver more Space Marines to enemy ships using boarding torpedoes, but a ship this size typically only holds one squad of Astartes warriors, so the plan was eventually abandoned. Vipers do still have a place in the larger fleets, however, their extra torpedo capacity proving deadly so long as other escorts are able to watch their flanks for them. One of the oldest Imperial designs in service, the Sword class is the escort vessel, and not because it's got particularly strong weaponry or because it has speed or even because it has advanced systems, it's because the Sword class is dependable. Its weapon batteries are the first real indication of this, swapping out the usual macro cannons or plasma-based arrays with more efficient laser batteries on both sides and a pair of turrets mounted on the forward spine. Using las weaponry allows the gunnery crews to keep up a steadier rate of fire than other options, and the twin turrets allow the frigate to cover a wider effective area, meaning that the Sword class escorts do a very good job at screening larger ships from incoming torpedoes, enemy escorts, and attack craft like bombers or boarding shuttles. Now that is a lot of close-ranged fighting for a light ship, but the Sword class is ready with thicker bulkheads and redundant support throughout the superstructure. This makes them tougher than most other escorts of their size, though not indestructible, but one of the reasons the Sword class is used by everyone from Space Marines to rogue traders and even pirate flotillas is that under most circumstances, a sword-class frigate could sustain some truly catastrophic damage and keep fighting. Even its engines were strong but simple, allowing the sword class to be fairly maneuverable while being fixable by even the most novice of adepts. Everything about this escort is designed to be stubborn. It can take more damage than other escorts, it has more reliable weaponry with greater coverage, and is so simple to maintain and operate that it can practically be run by servitors. Now, take a ship like that and put it in service to an elite force like the Space Marines, and it truly shines. The Astartes Void Navy is typically made up of similarly tough, dependable ships, so it's really not a surprise to see the sword class among Marine strike forces so often. What's more Space Marine than being able to take a broadside and still keep going? Okay, we are cheating a little bit with this entry because the Firestorm is a variant of the sword class frigate. It's got similar armor, the same dependable engines, power relays, and even mostly the same weapon loadout. And it's actually because of the sword class's dependability, especially with regards to its highly efficient laser weapon system, that the Firestorm even exists. Removing one of the forward battery turrets, the Firestorm reroutes a lot of its power to a new feature, a prow-mounted lance cannon. Lance weaponry is typically mounted on larger vessels, as the power needed to operate such impressive lasers normally takes a bigger reactor. Lances are highly focused beam weapons, not unlike the infantry portable las cannons used by most Imperial forces. A high-powered lance of energy is projected at a target, slicing through even the heaviest armor. Again, normally these sorts of cannons are mounted on much larger ships, so a Firestorm or two hidden in a swarm of other escorts is often a nasty surprise for an opposing force, and since Space Marines are very fond of anything that hits harder than it rightfully should, Firestorm frigates are often found escorting their larger spacecraft. The Hunter-class destroyer is the first truly Astartes vessel in this list, which is almost immediately apparent simply by the different shape language used in the construction of the ship's hull. The blocky utilitarian shape is pragmatic and leaves little room for the usual wildly ostentatious decoration normally seen on Imperial Navy ships of the same class. Buttresses and decorative windows give way to thickly armored bulkheads and extra reinforcement. In terms of its weapon loadout, however, we find that the Hunter is really just a more heavily armored Cobra. A simple macro cannon weapons battery along each side and torpedo tubes facing forward means that the Hunter fills the same niche in most Astartes navies, especially those of the Dark Angels, who don't trust other Imperial organizations and so don't make use of the Cobra class very often, if at all. So, just like the Cobra, the Hunter class is meant to exploit openings in enemy formations, using its torpedoes to cause massive damage to much larger ships from a relatively safe distance. Its superior armor means it can generally last longer in a close-range fight than the Cobra can, but with similar weapons, it's still best for a Hunter captain to fall back to the other escorts in the flotilla if they get caught out of position. Continuing the trend of Astartes ships that are basically just a better designed version of their Imperial Navy counterparts, the Gladius frigate is designed to fill the same role as the sword class. That is, it's a close-ranged brawler that can take hits all day while screening larger vessels. The Gladius has an efficient weapons battery which includes arrays on the port and starboard flanks, as well as 2 dorsal-mounted turrets placed forwards on the ship. Reliable engines and a tougher superstructure make the Gladius an almost one-for-one copy of the sword class, with a couple of exceptions. Once again, we see the blocky, no-nonsense design of a typical Astartes vessel, replacing the brutally elegant design of the Gothic sword class. This does of course come with extra armor, but also with engines that are reportedly about 20% more powerful than what the sword class has access to, making the Gladius not only a more resilient ship, but a faster one. This pulls everything together, allowing the Gladius to be a nimble and tough brawler in the way that an Astartes navy definitely prefers. It's still too small to carry more than a single squad of Space Marines, but since they won't be boarding anything, those warriors can spread out around the ship to supervise the mortal crew members and increase efficiency even more. The Gladius is probably the most widely used Astartes escort ship, and definitely the most numerous. That said, it seems like the sword class is still easier to build, so while the Gladius is a very common sight in Space Marine navies, sword class fans can absolutely still find plenty of their favorite escort being used, by various chapters for patrols and wider fleet engagements. The Nova class is the last escort vessel on our list today, and it is yet again a Space Marine version of an Imperial Navy ship, the Firestorm. A single weapons battery along both sides and a single turret allows the ship's reactor to support a prow-mounted lance weapon. Other than that, this is a standard Astartes escort vessel, extra armor, blocky shapes, and higher quality engines. The biggest reason to talk about the Nova is that the ship itself is something of a rarity in Astartes navies, owing mostly to the rules on how power and capability have been dispersed across various organizations of the Imperium after the Horus Heresy. Before the Heresy, Space Marine legions held immense power, leading armies and navies composed of personnel, equipment, vehicles, and ships of every possible sort. The Emperor wanted his legions to be able to fully pursue conflict however they chose, but after he was interred in the Golden Throne, his son Rabute Guilliman of the Ultramarines penned a couple of new rules that separated out many of those forces so that no single Space Marine force could ever hold so much power ever again. That brings us back to the Nova class, which is a bit of a problem in this regard. You see, every other Astartes ship is designed to be able to support a ground deployment. Either they can facilitate bombardments, troop deployments, or just ferry squads between other ships. Even other escorts like the Gladius and Hunter classes have multi-role capabilities that keep them in line with how the Astartes are allowed to operate. The Nova, however, is too much like the Firestorm in that they are both ship hunters. A lance weapon is a very effective way to take down capital ships, and that's something that Guilliman was very clear on. He wanted Marines to have to work with the Imperial Navy to be able to effectively do that. It's not as though the Marines don't have larger ships that can fight other capital-sized vessels, but having a dedicated ship hunter is an issue for most Imperial authorities. Nevertheless, Nova can occasionally be found in Astartes fleets, picking off larger ships whenever they get an opening. Strike cruisers take up a very unique place in the Space Marine Void Navy, exemplifying the Astartes war machine in a way that no other ship could. Escorts are a dime a dozen, battle barges are rare and too precious to waste on most engagements, but every single time a Space Marine force goes to war, a strike cruiser is there. They can hold an entire company of Astartes warriors, including support staff and vehicles, and are loaded to bear with everything a strike force needs to pursue an entire campaign from start to finish, while being able to hold its own in a space battle. In terms of displacement, strike cruisers are classified as light cruisers, tough ships that can survive longer engagements while still being fast and maneuverable. In terms of overall construction, you could certainly be forgiven for being a bit confused. The strike cruiser is more of a classification than it is a coherent class of spaceship. They come in various designs, with some older vessels clearly having been refitted Imperial Navy cruisers. Regardless of their origins though, most strike cruisers conform to the same basic blueprint. 2 weapons arrays along the sides with turrets scattered along its length, and a flight deck for a complement of Thunderhawk gunships for transportation and light support. But the real danger is its primary armament, the bombardment cannon. Being a ship whose primary role is supporting planetary invasions, almost all strike cruisers are equipped with a bombardment cannon, a turret-mounted linear accelerator, which uses magnetic force to propel its ammunition at a target, which is usually planetside. Usually. This ammunition is quite often a magma bomb, which burns with such intensity that it renders most armor completely useless and can turn entire biomes to ash before the strike cruiser launches its Space Marines to mop up any resistance. When used against other spacecraft, the bombardment cannon proves terrifyingly effective, and the descriptions make it seem like the magma bomb is very similar to Melta technology. Occasionally, one might find a strike cruiser armed with a Nova cannon instead, which takes the bombardment cannon concept and dials it up to 11. Nova cannons fire projectiles at near the speed of light, using a gravity array inside the barrel, allowing a Space Marine captain to obliterate targets from the other side of a planetary system. This comes at a great cost, however, as Nova cannons have been known to blow the relays out on battle barges, so a strike cruiser armed with one would almost destroy itself with the force used to fire a single shot. Aside from these more conventional weapons, strike cruisers are frequently armed with exterminatus weaponry, planet-killing munitions that are only ever used in worst-case scenarios, where it's better to sacrifice the planet rather than lose it to an enemy. And of course, how can we forget the crew themselves? As we mentioned earlier, a strike cruiser typically holds an entire company of Space Marines, over 100 superhuman warriors and their support staff, so you can bet that when fighting other ships, boarding parties are often the most effective weapon a strike cruiser has. And whether by Thunderhawk or by boarding torpedo, squads of Astartes breaching a ship usually signals the end of a fight. All told, the strike cruiser is the heart of a Space Marine Navy. No Astartes force can operate effectively without one, and they are one of the most versatile ground assault spaceships in the galaxy. It's a tough, fast, powerful warship, and more importantly, the strike cruiser is capable of handling all the needs of a campaigning army on its own. It's hard to find a ship more suited to the needs of the Adeptus Astartes. Unless, of course, you remember that the battle barge exists. The battle barge is the jewel of the Space Marine fleet, and the only true capital ship the Astartes has access to. They are hulking displays of Imperial power, tougher than just about any other ship in space, and able to carry more than 3 whole companies of Space Marines. This sort of power modifier is what makes a battle barge so important, but also very unique. Earlier, we mentioned that after the Horus Heresy, the Space Marine chapters were barred from having too much power in too many aspects of warfare at once, and so they had to give up the larger capital ships that they previously had enjoyed using in their navies. No Lunar class, no Infernus class, none of the large battleships that were now reserved for the Imperial Navy, at least not stock. Because battle barges, like strike cruisers, are not a specific type of ship, they're more of a classification applied to any Astartes capital ship that has been made or retrofitted to carry Space Marine battle groups to major campaigns. This means that while some of the relatively newer examples of a battle barge tend to have that familiar boxy Astartes look, some of the truly ancient vessels are clearly refits of other classes found in the Imperial Navy, like the Gloriana class or the Retribution class. Whatever their origin, battle barges are made with one thing in mind: planetary deployments, and it just so happens that being prepared to storm a planet's orbiting defenses and deploy an army of superhuman warriors to a planet while supporting them from space also makes a ship very well equipped to brawl with other ships fairly effectively. Gigantic weapons batteries line both sides of the ship with supporting torpedo tubes, and a massive flight deck for Thunderhawks and other ships designed to transport war gear and personnel. Then, of course, there are the bombardment cannons. Yes, we said cannons, plural, at least 3 of them in fact. Basically, a battle barge is designed to be the next step in ship evolution from the strike cruiser. The real threat of a battle barge is, of course, its toughness. Being primarily used for close support operations, it's inevitable that this gigantic battleship would end up taking a lot of fire, and so in typical Astartes fashion, every battle barge has been reinforced to be as tough as the Imperial Palace on Terra. And that's not an exaggeration. The methods used in construction of a battle barge's superstructure and armor plating involve hardening rare minerals in compression tanks on high-gravity moons. This ensures that even on retrofitted barges, the reinforced structure is literally as tough as the doors leading to the Emperor's throne room. After that, the ship is fitted with kilometers of plasteel and adamantium armor plating and buttresses, giving the vessel a typically brutal Astartes look while adding a little bit of Gothic flair that we usually see on Imperial Navy ships. Finally, there's the shields. We haven't talked much about the energy shields on the other ships in our list because we wanted to make the point that the battle barge is extra tough. Aside from the Geller fields that keep a ship safe while traveling through the warp, spaceships in 40K typically have a void shield, a powerful barrier that works by absorbing the energy of incoming attacks and dispersing it safely into the warp. Most ships only have enough power in their reactors to support a single layer of shielding like this, but a battle barge, well, they have 3. So on top of all the other layers of protection, this capital ship is even further protected by 3 layers of energy fields that can be brought back online should they ever take enough damage to overload, making a battle barge practically impossible to kill. The only downside to all of this is that, of course, it is rare to see more than perhaps 2 or 3 barges in an entire Space Marine chapter, which is why a chapter's battle barges are only used in extreme situations, meaning that usually the arrival of a navy led by one of these behemoths will either herald a swift surrender from the enemy force or its brutal demise. And there we have it. Like we said, not too many ships here, but it is a deadly fleet considering it has so few options. Let us know in the comments if you'd like to hear about those other fleets and how they are used. Space is a big place in 40k, and there's plenty to talk about. Until then, subscribe to make sure your Geller fields are charged to full, give us a like if you have faith in the Emperor, and we'll see you next time for more lore.